All right. So our next speaker is Ruchira Mandal from Jadavpur University from Kolkata, India. Ruchira is an assistant professor at the Department of English at Lady Brabourne College under the University of Calcutta, India. She wrote her MPhil thesis on the forms of governance in the works of 5 fantasy writers, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Christopher Paolini, Terry Pratchett, and Samit Basu, and is currently completing a doctoral thesis on Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast novels at Jadavpur University. Her research interests cover fantasy, popular culture, and fairy tales. And she'll be talking today on political idealism in the Discworld novels. So I know we're a couple minutes early, but I will hand it over to Ruchira.
Hi everyone, am I audible? My name is Ruchira Mandal, and I'm a little worried because a lot of my paper got discussed in the question answer session following the first very excellent paper on utopias, and I also don't have a very interesting PPT like the last two papers. I'm going to be talking about politics in the Discworld, and the idea of the idle realm in fantasy and how that works out in a very postmodern fantasy world such as the Discworld. In traditional fantasy, such as in The Lord of the Rings, conflict is resolved through the establishment of idle realms and thereby the elimination of discord in the kingdom. This is an impossibility in Terry Pratchett's Discworld, which is a melting pot of species and races and classes and cultures. As Havelock Veterinary, the patrician of Ankh-Morpork, advises Samuel Vimes, do not seek perfection, none exists. All we can do is strive. Pratchett juxtaposes real-world issues such as crime, migration, racism within the conventions of genre fantasy, making governance a matter of efficient management rather than of virtue or nobility. In Discworld, and especially so in its greatest city, Ankh-Morpork, there is no harmonious body politic because the various parts are constantly in disagreement with each other, and yet, under efficient governance, the system seems to work. Uh, Trying to figure out how to, yeah. Pratchett does not offer one single political system as an ideal, instead presenting various modes such as monarchy, tyranny, or aristocracy in various locations along the disc. The purpose of this paper will be to examine these various modes of governance in comparison with the Aristotelian categories of governance in politics. Aristotle names 3 broad types of right governance: monarchy or rule of one, aiming at the common interest, that is kingship; rule of more than one man, but only a few, aristocracy, where the best men rule, aiming for the best of the state; and political control exercised by the mass of populace in the common interest, or polity. The corresponding deviations are from kingship, tyranny; from aristocracy, oligarchy; from polity, democracy. For tyranny is monarchy for the benefit of the monarch, oligarchy for the benefit of the men of means, democracy for the benefit of men without means. On the Discworld, we find some examples of most of these forms. Clutch, Lancre, the Aegean Empire are all monarchies of some form, as is Omnia, which, though a theocracy, is governed by the single ruler, who is the head of the Omnian Church. In Uberworld, an interspecies power balance is maintained between the aristocratic vampires and werewolves and dwarves, while within their society the dwarves have their own elected king. In the shires where Lady Sybil has her ancestral house, aristocratic rule has degenerated into oligarchy, where the rich people seek their own benefits. The only known democracy is Ephebe, where everyone has a vote, except for women, of course, and children, and criminals, and slaves, and stupid people, and people of foreign extraction, and people disapproved of for various reasons, and lots of other people, but everyone apart from them. This leaves us with Ankh-Morpork, which practices the form of democracy known as one man, one vote. The patrician was the man, he had the vote. In effect, it is a tyranny ruled by the single figure of the patrician who is officially a tyrant. In Ankh-Morpork, there is no separation between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of the government. The patrician frames laws, sits in judgment, and controls the law enforcement force that is the city watch. He also clamps down on dissent, mostly from the various city guilds and the influential aristocrats, by a combination of direct and indirect threats, espionage, and manipulation of information. Yet despite such absolute and tyrannical power, the city functions well under veterinary. It was a funny thing, I quote, but everyone seemed to want to live under the despotic rule of the tyrannical Lord Veterinary. Or as the wizard Carding puts it in the novel Sorcery, he is unfair and unjust, but scrupulously even-handed. He is unfair and unjust to everyone without fear or favor. Under him, Ankh-Morpork slowly emerges from its medieval stupor and steps into a new technological era. Although Aristotle in Book 3, Chapter 7 of Politics defines tyranny as a distorted form of monarchy where the ruler pays heed to his own interests rather than those of the state, we find Veterinary, despite the temptation of scorpion pits and swords made of the blood of 1,000 men, to be a remarkably selfless ruler devoted to the good of the state, fulfilling Aristotle's statement that the sole proper claim to political power is that of virtue, that is, the moral and intellectual ability always needed to be a statesman, a citizen who is ruled and rules by turn in the interests of the whole state. As he reminds Captain Carrot in Men at Arms, Veterinary is a politician, and the term politician, like the term policeman, comes from polis or city. Thus, like Carrot and Vimes, he too is a man of the city. He has no vices except for an addiction of crosswords and does not misuse the city's money for personal luxuries. And unlike the honest, noble, and good Clutchin Prince in the novel Jingo and many real world leaders, Veterinary doesn't use patriotic rhetoric to stabilize his power, using his guile and cunning instead to prevent war. Rather than an absolute tyrant with accountability, he falls rather into the third category of kingship, defined by Aristotle in Book 3, Chapter 14, as elective dictatorship over a willing populace and subject to law. Despite reveling in his reputation as a tyrant, Veterinary takes pains to maintain the law, choosing to work within its scope, such as when he refuses to charge Gravid Rust in the novel Snuff with murder rather than the manslaughter of a goblin girl, because the law can't be applied retrospectively. However, he also uses extra-legal and underhand measures behind the scenes, such as when he makes Moise von Lipwig the Postmaster General instead of hanging him, or arranges for Gravid's accidental death despite being unable to sentence him because, as he explains to Drumknot, not all sins are forgiven. Because of Veterinary's absolute control of all branches of governance, he is able to make quick decisions on behalf of the city that is often not agreeable to the rich and powerful of Ankh-Morpork, who stand to lose out their privileges. Under him, Ankh-Morpork gradually becomes more egalitarian, with dwarfs, trolls, vampires, werewolves, golems, and goblins all gaining the rights of sapient species. His reign thus showed the surprising benefits of a dictatorship and absolute power vested in a single individual. However, such power as Veterinary wields could lead to disaster in the hands of a less well-meaning leader, such as his predecessors, Lord Winter or Mad Lord Snapcase, or a well-meaning but less competent leader such as Lord Rust. By his own submission, his predecessors were gross men for the most part, greedy, venal, and clumsy. Most of them died rich, fat, and terrified. They left the city worse for their incumbency and better for their death. Veterinary is thus, despite being a tyrant, an idle ruler, whereas real-world examples constantly teach us how dangerous it can be when too much power is invested in a single individual, or when the ruler becomes an untouchable, almost godlike figure with a cult following. Such states in the real world deviate inevitably towards fascism, But Ankh-Morpork continues to progress because despite being scheming and manipulative, veterinary works only for the interest of the state. In chapter 15 and 16 of Politics, Aristotle analyzes in length on whether it is the best man or the best law that constitutes good government, and declares that law is intelligence without appetition. Thus, one ought to seek the rule of good law rather than the rule of a good individual, because the former is not affected by human irrationalities and desires. This brings us to the question of what really constitutes successful governance on the disc. Monarchy in Lancre works because it is nearly secluded from the world with a tiny homogeneous population. Besides, its real power resides with the witches. As Pratchett says in his essay Imaginary Worlds, Real Stories, Lancre is solid folklore. But the same system of governance is not so successful in the geographically larger and far more divided clutch, often with rulers who are more invested in control rather than peace and order. In words, the theocracy of Omnia is shown to be a repressive regime of almost Orwellian horror where no deviation is tolerated and the deacon of the Inquisition holds absolute power. However, when Bruther the prophet becomes the Cenobiarch of the Church, the same system adjusts itself to a benevolent regime. The quality and nature of governance thus seem to depend not on the system but on the person at the helm of it. Aristotle declares that the judgment of one man is bound to be corrupted if he is in a bad temper or has very strong feelings about something. While this is true, in the Discworld, anger often plays a big role in the execution of justice with characters such as Granny Weatherwax and Sir Samuel Vimes. Sam Vimes is the commander of the Ankh-Morpork City Watch, and as a policeman, he is painstakingly aware of his role as a keeper of the peace within the framework of law. As he calls himself a civilian with a uniform and a badge. Just as he is aware of his inner anger that is constantly threatening to override his rational judgments, every time Commander Vimes dragged some vicious and inventive murderer to such mercy or justice as the law in its wisdom determined, there was another Vimes, a ghost Vimes, whose urge to chop that creature into pieces on the spot had to be chained. Yet, Vimes is able to exercise his powers as a policeman despite opposition from the powerful for two reasons, the first being the tacit support of the patrician veterinary, and the second being Vimes' own personal anger at social injustice and what he calls private law, both of which are dependent on persons rather than the law. And despite his insistence on obeying the law, Vimes sometimes resists or circumvents orders from authorities such as in Night Watch, in Snuff, for the sake of justice. In a conversation with Lady Sybil, Vimes agonizes over using the law ad hoc in the course of justice, and Sybil assures him that for a good cause justifies the means. But Vimes is aware that this philosophy can be used to justify both good and bad things. This happens in Witches Abroad when Esme's sister Lily Weatherwax turns Genoa into a cage in an effort to make it a fairy tale land. As Aristotle himself admits, law can and does affect the bias of its framers. Justice thus depends on individual moral compass rather than on the system which can always be manipulated. In a 2014 article in The Guardian, Neil Gaiman writes about Pratchett. Anger is the engine that drives him, but it is the greatness of spirit that deploys that anger on the side of the angels, or better yet for all of us, the orangutans. Although Pratchett reveals a certain degree of cynicism in the Discworld novels towards political idealism, such as things that came up in the previous discussion, novels like Interesting Times and Night Watch, where we have popular revolutions that don't really meet their goals. It nevertheless remains an idealistic world where political changes can be wrought by a piece of music played by a goblin girl. One spends one's life scheming, negotiating, giving and taking, and greasing such wheels as squeak, and in general doing one's best to stop this battered old world from exploding into pieces. And now, because of a piece of music, some very powerful states have agreed to work together to heal the problems of another autonomous state, and almost as a collateral, turn some animals into people at a stroke. It is a world where, irrespective of legal system, rulers such as Risen, Lady Margalotta, the Diamond King of the Trolls, the Patrician, and the Commander of the Watch all work to preserve order, sometimes using the law and sometimes amending it. When veterinary orders the death of gravid rust, because not all sins can be forgiven, he is following the same moral compass that Vimes follows of not treating people as lesser beings. Because once goblins are vermin, then the poor are vermin, and the dwarfs are vermin, and the trolls are vermin. The same moral perspective from which Captain Carrot refuses to become the king of Ankh-Morpork, in spite of being good at being obeyed, because you can't treat people like puppet dolls. In this, Pratchett is moving away from the Aristotelian idea of justice, which says justice is equality, and so it is, but not for all persons, only for those that are equal. Inequality is also thought to be just, and so it is, but not for all, only for the unequal. People are generally bad judges where their own interests are involved. The sin that Veterinary speaks of is defined by Weatherwax in a conversation with Pastor Rhodes in Carpegigulum. I'm sorry, not this. Not this. And sin, young man, is when you treat people as things, including yourself. That's what sin is. When people say things are a lot more complicated than that, they means that they are getting worried that they won't like the truth. People as things, that's where it starts. A Vimes or a veterinary may not have any idealistic belief in the innate goodness of people, but they do believe in their essential humanity. Like their author, Pratchett's characters are also, despite the anger and the cynicism, on the side of the angels. Thank you. Um, I'm actually done if you want to ask questions.
Great, thank you for that. That was a really in-depth analysis of the political systems of Discworld, and yeah, I guess we'll open it up to questions from the listeners. I think you inspired a quite in-depth conversation, so thank you again. It seems like just I'll get things going. It almost seems in a way that you're sort of giving more evidence, sort of suspicion of utopianism or a utopian impulse in systems of governments. Would you say that's an accurate representation of your research, or do you think it's a little bit more complicated than just straightforwardly utopian or dystopian systems of governance? And is there room for sort of movement of various actors within that binary? And when I say actors, I
I
mean
think,
characters.
yeah, which is what I was saying, because as some of my paper was actually overlapping with what David said in his
Mm,
first paper. There is an idea of, although Pratchett is very cynical about this whole idea of
mm,
idealism, but there is this an inherent idea of utopianism, not in the system itself, but in the the people that he put in places, who are in the right places and the right governments, who
mhm,
uh, make the disc world. It's not a perfect world,
mhm,
or I would say, unlike Middle Earth, it's not a homogeneous world. It's a
mhm,
very chaotic world of a lot of clashing cultures. So, like I said, the first
mhm.
quote I used, you cannot have perfection, but
Yeah.
it is a striving towards utopia.
Mhm. Yeah. Like Utopia is a process.
Yes.
Okay, we have a few questions coming in. Oh, I just found one. Okay, do you think Pratchett favored one form of rulership over another?
Um, well, I would say he was running this experiment of looking at, considering that Ankh-Morpork is the one government which is discussed in length in all the novels. I mean, in places like Lancre or Uberworld, you have supernatural elements coming in, and we don't really look deeply in the Agatean Empire or Ephebi, which is a democracy, and democracy in Ephebi is actually satirized by him in the one novel that it turns up, Pyramids. So I would say he was looking at the concept of the ideal single ruler, um, which is, I would say, tyranny, as we see in veterinary, is a form of monarchy, one of the 5 types of kingship that Pratchett discusses. But then also he looks at bad forms of monarchy, as in the empire or in Omnia, or
Hmm.
for that matter in Ankh-Morpork, the rulers before veterinary. So the whole idea is ideal because veterinary is that one ideal ruler.
Mm. Great, and that sort of anticipates one of the questions that asks, do you think Vetinari is almost an idealized philosopher king?
Yeah, yeah, I actually think he is. He is one of those
Hmm.
philosopher kings.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's a short answer.
Great.
Even though he's actually, he appears to be cynical, and
Mm.
but even in his name, he's veterinary. He's, if you look at Aragon, for example, he's a healer of his people. There's a sequence in The Return of the King where he actually goes around healing people, or Lucy Pevensey as a Queen of Narnia, who's a healer of her people. Veterinary
Hmm.
is also, in a way, a healer, and that's his name. It's just that he has a more Hobbesian view of society where people are more beastly than humans.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Next question. Pratchett has a lot of characters who are seemingly designed or destined to rule lead, i.e., Carrot, Veterinary, Granny. But throughout the Watch books, especially, monarchy is strongly resisted as a method of rule. What are your thoughts about this apparent friction between what the text says and what it shows with its characters? It's an
Could I
interesting
have the
question.
question again?
Yes,
Uh,
sure. So, Pratchett has a lot
okay,
of
I'm just
characters who are
reading.
seemingly. Oh, sorry. I'll let you
Yeah,
read.
yeah, veterinary granny, but uh, well, I think there's a paradox because veterinary system
Mm,
of governance is, in essence, a form of monarchy. Like I said, it's the
mhm,
third type of kingship in politics, which is elective dictatorship. But
mhm,
there is also Carrot saying that one mustn't rule simply because one is good at being obeyed.
mhm,
So I think he is resisting that idea of cult following, which you get. For example, when Aragon arrives as a king, there's a sort of, uh, he's greeted as a sort of semi-divine figure, which he is in the context of Middle Earth. So he doesn't really want to build that kind of an image around a single person. But the paradox there that veterinary is an almost superhuman kind of super figure, super ruler. So that's a paradox.
mhm,
And that's also
mhm,
part of the inherent idealism that's there in novels.
mhm. Sure. Let's see. Okay. I always wondered, someone asked, I always wondered if a novel concept was going to be veterinary retiring and then there being elections with moist carrot vines and a Rust-esque character running. Who do you think would win an election in Ankh-Morpork?
Yes, I think that also came up in the first discussion. Uh, I think if it's a popularity contest, it's going to be Moist Von Lippic. I think Garrett would not contest because of the kind of person he is, and Moist is very good at being popular. But I also
Hmm.
think Vettery would not leave it to an election if he's going to. I think he said in his first paper that he was grooming Moise Van Lippig and Vimes and Carrot, but he would maybe like have governments transcending from the rule of one to a rule of few. So maybe we would move from the rule of veterinary to the single patrician rule of sort of comity of efficient men. So I think that was what we were going towards. So, but if it's an election, I think it would be Moist Van Lopig. And yes, Carrot is popular, but I think Carrot wouldn't contest.
Right. And folks listening, it'll be interesting to see who if you agree or disagree with Ruchira's choice. We've already had Moist for president in the comments, so.
So there's
okay, and follow up
in making money, the reference there's this like a small discussion between Vimes and not Vimes, sorry, veterinary about Lipwig's popularity, and veterinary considers sending him to take charges of the tax department next, which is a very unpopular job. So I wish he had written that book. I'd like to see how that turned out.
A follow-up to that would be, do you think desk/Trumpy character would work in Ankh-Morpork?
Again, I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Sure. Do you think a Rust-esque Trumpy character would work, or do you not think a Rust-esque Trumpy character would work in Ankh-Morpork?
Well, I think Rust temporarily takes up power in Jingo when they depose veterinary because in a state of war. And I think I addressed it because I wouldn't say Rust is exactly a Trump-like character, because Rust is well-meaning and honorable. He has just a very different idea of what constitutes the good of state. And I think, as Jingo proves, and also Vimes keeps talking about his war records, he has won a lot of medals in war, I think, but he has also had a lot of people killed. So he's essentially a general who gets carried away by Jingoism. So I don't think he would be a very good ruler.
Okay, next question. Do you think we pay enough attention to changing systems in Terry Pratchett's lands? And this commentary is particularly thinking about Magrat trying to enact agricultural reform in Lancre, I guess, somewhat unsuccessful. First boy witch in the book, so their feudal world is changing. So again, the question is, do you think we pay enough attention to these changing systems in Terry Pratchett's works?
Well, in Lancre, I think Paris is not very good at bringing about these changes, because like it's a very small place and the people are mostly the quote I shared, the people are mostly very independent minded. They like having a king, but they don't really like being told what to do. But I think where changes are happening on a broad scale is where is work. And again, with the introduction of the train, the railways, the clacks, I think that is going to affect. We do see this world changing, the world moving into a technological era where communications are opening up, printing presses are opening up. So yes, I do think there is attention to that movement and changes. I would be interested to see, again, that was a novel that was, I think, not written, but how Lancre would deal with railways and clacks.
Yeah, and yeah, the comments are sort of agreeing with you for sure. Are there any more
Yeah,
questions?
I think I agree to this. Mathematic Richard Guild is a kind of Trump. In fact, his office is called the Trump Tower.
There we go.
Yes. And the unprincipled businessman, so there. And not really a good rule.
I think I've covered everything in the questions. So unless anybody wants to jump in with any final questions for Ruchira, we could have a short 12-minute break before our last talk in the panel. So yeah, let's all say thank you again to Ruchira, and thank you as always for your questions.
Thank you very much.
And we'll take a short break now, and everyone back here at 12:15.